сессию. От имени Академии народного хозяйства поздравляю с началом Гайдаровского форума 2017 года. И в рамках него одно из самых первых мероприятий презентация доклада Всемирного банка. Российская Федерация может ставить географическое исследование экономики учитывая достижение всеобъемлющего экономического роста. Хотел бы представить сначала участников этой панели. У нас сегодня два докладчика, представители Всемирного банка Анна Ревенга, заместитель главного экономиста Всемирного банка, и Cyril Muller, вице-президент Всемирного банка по Европе и Центральной Азии. И панелисты, которые будут комментировать, задавать вопросы, уточняющие Ksenia Юдаева, заместитель председателя Центрального банка Российской Федерации, Владимир Kolychev, заместитель министра финансов Российской Федерации, председатель Евразийского банка развития Владимир Pankin и директор Института мировой экономики и народных отношений Aleksey Dynkin.
International relations. We have a pretty tight deadline for this session because at noon, once we're done, we're gonna have the key plenary session of the forum. So we are supposed to meet the deadline. And without further ado, would like to go ahead with the presentation proper, and I suggest Anna Revenga would be the first to speak.
Good morning, estimated panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first thank you on behalf of the World Bank Group for this opportunity to present to you our report, Pathways to Inclusive Growth, Russian Federation Systematic Country Diagnostics. I am going to share the presentation with my colleague, Mr. Cyril Muller. I will do the first half of the presentation, which focuses on the diagnostics, and he will talk about the policies and the priorities going forward. And I will try to stick to my time limit. The moderator will make sure that if I'm going on too long, I will go faster and be more brief. Let me perhaps start just by looking at a snapshot of the recent economic growth performance for Russia. And what you see in this graph is not a surprise to any of you, but it shows that the growth trends in Russia over the past 2 decades were very closely linked to several things, the path of oil prices, as well as Russia's legacy of transition and structural reform. After a difficult transition period in the 1990s, and starting in the year 2000, the combination of favorable external environment, sound macroeconomic fundamentals, and sound fiscal management ushered in an area of strong, inclusive growth in Russia. This is a period, you can see in the graph, the lines that show GDP, that show oil prices, and that also show 2 important measures of well-being, what happened to poverty in Russia and what happened to the incomes of the bottom 40% of the population. What in the World Bank we use as a measure of shared prosperity. That is, a prosperity that reaches everybody in the population, including the most disadvantaged. This period up to 2012 is a period not only of strong economic growth, but of increases in the incomes of the bottom 40 and of sharp declines in poverty as measured by the national poverty rate, which declined from 29% in the year 2000 to 10.7% in 2012. Starting in 2012, however, we see a deceleration of growth, and that progress that we've seen in the incomes of the bottom 40 and in poverty comes to a halt. And in fact, we saw an increase in poverty between 2013 and 2015. I think it's important to note that while the drop in oil prices caused the Russian economy to enter a recession, the deceleration of growth and the halting of the progress in terms of improving the incomes of the bottom actually predates the sharp drop in oil prices. So there's some signs that the model of economic growth was reaching some of its limits. I think one of the most positive outcomes of this period of strong inclusive growth was that during this period we saw a large group of the population exit poverty, exit a state of vulnerability, and enter what we would call the economically secure population. The World Bank uses a threshold of consumption per capita of $10 a day to define this category of economically secure. It's a threshold that may seem inadequate to people in a country such as Russia. It is a threshold that analytically we've seen in many countries to correlate with escaping the risk of falling back into poverty. So in much of our comparative analysis, we use this threshold to identify the emergence of an incipient middle class. And by this standard, Russia did extremely well during this period. In fact, it showed the highest upward economic mobility, the highest income mobility of any of the BRICS, and the highest movement into this category of the economically secure population. However, if you dig a little bit into this phenomenon and into this period, you'll see that there's a very distinct breaking point. The period 2000 to 2008 is one in which this upward mobility, this improvement in the incomes of the bottom 40 was driven by wage growth. That is, by productivity gains that resulted from allocation of labor to better jobs with higher wages. And this is what drove those increases in income up to 2008. So it's a very positive driver of improvement in incomes. Starting in 2008, however, we see a pattern in the change of the drivers of the improvements in the income of the bottom. It's no longer so much wage growth driving that income mobility. It is actually pensions and transfers. This in itself was a worrying sign even before Russia hit recession, because there's some limitations to how much you can sustain in terms of income increases when the main driver is through fiscal policy. Russia is not unique in this sense, and I want to highlight that the same picture you would get, for example, for Brazil. The same pattern of strong inclusive growth, but also the same pattern of income growth driven by productivity at the beginning of the 2000s and then by fiscal transfers in the second half. So it's a phenomenon that is true in Russia. It is true in some other middle income, high middle income, large commodity exporters as well. Even without the recession and the difficult period that you have gone through, this graph would suggest that the sustainability of the pattern of inclusive growth was at risk because of potential fiscal pressures, because of obvious trade-offs between fiscal sustainability and this growth path. So in many ways, looking at this data suggests that the model has been very successful, that the model needs to revive the more sustainable drivers of economic growth, that is productivity that leads to better jobs and better incomes. One of the things that I think characterizes Russia and distinguishes it from many of the other high middle income economies that we work on is the fact that Russia has a very strong underlying social contract. A contract which gives the state a very important role in the provision of jobs. The public sector is a very large employer, employs about a third of formal sector employees. It gives the state a very important job in the provision of health and education, of free health and education. It gives the state a very important job in the provision of a large number of benefits and social protection benefits and systems. This, of course, in a context of high economic growth, high commodity prices is a social contract that is generous but affordable. In a context of lower commodity prices, weaker growth, the social contract becomes less affordable and is at some risk. So it becomes particularly important, I think, and this is what the report tries to do, to say if one wants to preserve the social contract, which has yielded an inclusive growth path and a fair amount of income mobility, if one wants to preserve that social contract, then it is fundamental to revisit the drivers of growth and to actually put the economy on a pathway where the driver of growth is productivity increases, productivity growth, and the creation of new, higher value-added activities and higher value-added jobs, that those be the drivers of higher incomes for broad parts of the population. So this report tries to look very much at what does it take to do that? What are some of the constraints that get in the way of productivity growth and of underpinning a more sustainable and long-term growth path? And I want to highlight again that the performance of Russia between 2000 and 2012 was extremely successful by any global measure. In my previous position, I was in charge of the work of the World Bank on poverty and equity, and Russia was one of the top performers in this regards. So that the concern is, how do you maintain that? How do you keep that momentum going? And Russia has its own set of special challenges. The vastness of its territory, the diversity of its territory means that even when it's performing well, there's diversity in outcomes. The performance on poverty was great on aggregate, and yet we know that there are substantial disparities, especially across regions, in terms of poverty rates, in terms of other measures of well-being, such as health outcomes and so forth. So the challenge for Russia is considerable, and it's really a medium-term challenge. In the short term, our forecast, and I think it aligns quite well with the government's own forecast, is that we will see a recovery of growth, an inching towards growth in 2017 and 2018 under a more positive scenario for oil prices. But the expectation is that this growth will remain relatively modest unless some deep reforms are put in place that can unleash the dynamism of different parts of the Russian economy and that can unleash a real surge in productivity growth. So the focus of our analysis, which I hope you will find useful, is very much on identifying what are the constraints that get in the way of productivity growing, what are some of the potential opportunities and the potential new drivers for growth. And we do this analysis explicitly using three complementary lenses. We believe that it's not just sufficient to look at economic growth and what it will take to revive growth. Very clear that there's a set of actions that revolve around revitalizing productivity and also around the supportive investments in physical and human capital that are needed to underpin long-term productivity growth. But we also believe it's very important to bring an equity lens. And clearly Russia's performance over this period of 2000 to 2012 signals that this is a country that cares about inclusion and cares about prosperity being shared. So we bring to the analysis an equity lens that for us is complementary and equal in importance to the growth lens. And we also bring a sustainability lens that I will not talk about, but my colleague will. And sustainability understood broadly in all its dimensions: fiscal sustainability, social sustainability, and environmental sustainability. So if I start by focusing on the economic growth part of the analysis, and I've anticipated already that what we think here is most important is to really unleash productivity growth and the key drivers of productivity growth in Russia. And here we identify constraints at three different levels. Constraints that you could say are economy-wide, constraints that are at the level of the firms, and constraints at the level of the individuals. I think one interesting graph to look at in starting this discussion is the graph of what's happened to productivity growth over these last 2 decades, over that same period of growth that I showed you at the very beginning. And what you can see is that there's, again, a very clear pattern. The period starting in 2000, there is a period in which some of the reforms that were done before paid off in terms of better allocation of capital and labor, reallocation of capital and labor to higher value-added activities. And you see a period from 2000 to 2008 in which productivity growth is quite strong. And there are contributions from capital, in orange. There's contributions from labor flowing to higher productivity activities, in blue. And there's also a very important contribution from total factor productivity. So this is a period in which the productivity performance of the Russian economy is quite strong, and that led to increases in income and increases in well-being. Clearly, there's a change in 2008 with the crisis, a fast recovery from the crisis, but a very different pattern of productivity growth following that. Total factor productivity no longer appears as a driver of productivity growth. The gray part of the bar either disappears or becomes slightly negative. The labor contribution to productivity growth becomes negligible. And capital still plays a role, but overall the level of productivity growth drops significantly. And this is the point of concern. How do you actually reverse this trend and go back to a period where you see productivity growth stemming from the contribution of capital, labor, and total factor productivity? We identify, the analysis is very detailed, and I don't have time in the presentation to go into it at depth, but we identify 3 areas of what we would call economy-wide constraints. The first has to do with an eroding physical capital base, in particular aging infrastructure and important infrastructure gaps. Some areas of infrastructure Russia performs very well. In others, it actually is facing more challenges. The transport network in particular is aged. It's in need of significant investment. The weaknesses in this transport network directly affect the competitiveness of some Russian sectors and firms. It also negatively affects some regions which are more poorly connected, and the lack of connectivity impacts their ability to take advantage of international markets and trade integration and impacts their growth prospects. So clearly, the revitalization of infrastructure is one constraint that we think is important to address to underpin better productivity performance. I think another set of economy-wide constraints have to do with the investment climate. Addressing Russia's infrastructure needs and infrastructure gap will require more than public investment. It will require mobilizing private investment as well. And private investment can be an important contributor to innovation, to productivity growth. Here, there's been enormous improvements in terms of Russia's regulatory environment. Russia's ranking in the doing business has gone up steadily and significantly over the last few years. There's been enormous progress in certain dimensions of the investment climate, but firms still face some challenges in operating their businesses. And there's some dimensions of the regulatory environment and the investment climate in which Russia could still improve its performance. Some of these are identified very concretely in the report. Logistics, Russia is a mediocre performer in terms of logistics. That again affects competitiveness and productivity. So there's scope there to improve. Some of it's linked to infrastructure, but not all of it. There's also, I think, a very important point about leveling the playing field. There's a sense that there's a certain lack of competition in markets that actually acts against innovation and acts against productivity. Some of this is actually linked to the very large presence of the state in certain sectors. We don't try to estimate the magnitude of state involvement in the Russian economy. It's actually very difficult to do. Instead, as we look at particular sectors where the presence of the state and state-owned enterprises is quite large. And these are sectors such as extractives, financial sector, infrastructure sectors, and the media. This dominant position of the state in some of these sectors actually can have some detrimental effects to the entry of new dynamic firms. It can have detrimental effects on the incentives for innovation. It also makes Russia in many ways more vulnerable to shocks because ownership and market power are very, very concentrated. So in addition to these economy-wide constraints, we also look at what happens inside firms, and we also look at individuals. And here there are two things I would like to mention. The first is at the level of the firm, Russia could do better in terms of innovation. It is lagging behind some of its comparator countries in terms of both dimensions of innovations. Catch-up innovation, which involves introducing new but existing technologies, production processes into firms so as to make them more productive and more efficient. It also lags behind in terms of frontier innovation, that is the generation, the creation of actual new processes and technology. It's estimated that only about 10% of Russian firms report engaging in technological innovation activity. The mean for the OECD is around 30%, although I think there's a lot of variance across OECD countries. So overall, there's a sense that Russia could do better, particularly because Russia has some very strengths and a comparative advantage in certain sectors, including in the ICT space. But here, interestingly, and what you see in the graph is that while the government of Russia and the Russian population has been quite an active adopter of new ICT technology, and in fact does quite well relative to OECD comparators, Russian firms have been much slower in adopting technology, and they actually lag more dramatically behind firms in the rate of adoption of firms in the OECD. So here's obviously an area where policy can have a big impact. And part of the reason that Russia may lag in terms of innovation has to do with the skills and a skill gap. Russia has a very high level of educational attainment. It has higher tertiary, post-secondary and tertiary enrollment rates than many of comparative countries, certainly than most of the BRICS, all of the BRICS, and more than some high-income economies. But the success in terms of educational attainment doesn't mean that there aren't skill gaps. Businesses actually report gaps in certain types of skills, not so much technical skills, but these are the higher order cognitive skills such as problem solving, decision making, and soft skills, that is communication skills, collaboration skills, teamwork skills. These are skills that are very much in demand in a modern economy and very much in demand by innovative firms. If you look at the changes in the scale composition of occupations, you'll see that in the modern economy, it is these higher order cognitive and soft non-cognitive skills that really, really matter for performance. And that's where Russia still has a gap. The Russian education system performs extremely well in early ages. So Russian children, 7 to 10, outperform children in other OECD economies, including much of the EU in terms of reading and mathematics. By the time kids are 15, that advantage has reduced a little bit, although the last set of PISA studies shows very good results. But it's when you move beyond secondary into the post-secondary world, and especially when you move out of the education system into the system of skill development and skill acquisition for people that had left the education system or in the workplace, that's where some of the weaknesses start to show up. There is not a strong system of lifelong learning. Russia is not unique in that way. That is true in many, many countries of the world. There isn't a lot of reskilling, retraining that is happening in the workplace. That, again, is a problem that many countries face. But with the aging of the population and with the modern economy changing the skill demands much more frequently than in the past, this ability to create a system through which workers can reskill becomes very fundamental, and I think is another area of priority going forward. Let me, and for the sake of time, just skip very quickly over this slide. I think what I wanted to highlight is that Russia has very high labor force participation rates. It has low unemployment, but we have seen some shift into informality since 2009, which may be a contributor to the weaker productivity performance. The biggest challenge facing Russia going forward in terms of its labor resources is, of course, the shrinking and aging labor force, which could have an important impact on economic performance unless one is able to extend working life productively. And that requires action not only in terms of extending retirement ages, but more fundamentally in terms of creating the systems that allow workers to reskill and acquire new skills. And it also requires workers to be healthy, to be productive. So there's an agenda there that will be quite important and that links directly to the equity lens that we wanted to mention. So we've talked about two fundamental pathways for Russia to regain a strong process of inclusive economic growth. One pathway focuses on productivity. The other pathway focuses on deepening investments in human capital, reducing vulnerability, and creating the conditions for all parts of Russian society to participate in the growth process. And here I just want to mention quickly three things. First of all, coming back to the education system and highlighting again that Russia has high educational attainment, wide access. There's very little evidence of inequalities in access to education, but there are signs that there are inequalities in the education system that manifest themselves in other ways. There are signs that the skills of the socioeconomic background and learning outcomes and skills are actually correlated. It's true for adults. We find that poorer adults tend to have worse basic skills. That is hard to disentangle which way the causality goes. But I think what's more worrisome is that we also find that youth from poorer backgrounds tend to have worse learning outcomes than youth from more advantaged backgrounds. This is not unique to Russia. In fact, it is a global phenomenon. We find that overall, across the globe, there's a bit of a learning crisis. Children going to school, but not necessarily learning. And that invariably, in most countries of the world, poor children have worse learning outcomes than better off children. And that's a reason for concern because it links to the quality of education they're receiving. If it's not addressed, it can create very deep inequalities that transmit themselves from one generation to the next. So focusing not on access but on quality may be the key to preventing these inequalities from solidifying and growing. Another area in which there are deep inequalities by socioeconomic background is health. This is an area in which Russia could perform better. Russia actually lags behind many high middle income and high income countries in terms of health outcomes, particularly life expectancy is quite low, especially for men. And you can see that in the chart. The countries such as China, starting off from a much lower base, have actually passed Russia in terms of male life expectancy. And what you see in the graph as well is that the inequalities in health outcomes are not random. They're actually linked very much to education, socioeconomic background. And while health outcomes have improved in Russia considerably over the last decades, these inequalities and these gaps remain. Again, Russia is not unique in this way. We find increasingly as we look at health inequalities all over the world, we find that there's a very strong correlation between socioeconomic background and longevity and health outcomes. And this is a concern, and it's a particular concern as societies age, because as societies age, these inequalities will become even more manifest. In the case of Russia, and I think I'm running out of time, so I won't go into much detail, a lot of this gap in life expectancy and the gap in mortality is associated with cardiovascular disease. And hence, there are interventions that are relatively non-costly, that could actually have a big impact. Russia's inpatient care system is actually quite equal and quite progressive. It's less so when it comes to outpatient care, and the priority there would be to strengthen primary care and to strengthen outpatient care to make sure these inequalities are addressed. And then to finish, my last point has to do with the role of social protection. Russia has a very comprehensive system of social protection that has played an important role in reducing poverty, particularly pensions. Pensions have been a very important contributor to reducing poverty. There's a very high elasticity of poverty reduction with respect to pensions. There, the challenges have to do with the aging of the population and the need to put the system on a sustainable footing. On social assistance, Russia spends about 2.7% of GDP. This is comparable to what EU countries spend. It has an impact on poverty, but you would expect it to have more. So there is room there to address issues of fragmentation, to improve the targeting of social assistance spending, and generally to increase efficiency and to be able to achieve more with a slightly smaller funding envelope. So I will leave it there. This is an analysis of the constraints and the diagnostic. So I've pointed out a number of problems. My colleague will talk about looking forward, what are some of the policy actions that can address those constraints and release growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I will share with you, actually, I'll cover two sets of areas. First, I would like to focus on what I would call the cross-cutting foundations that are required for inclusive growth. And into that, two of those cross-cutting foundations, cross-cutting requisites, are common to many countries. And these are fiscal sustainability and good governance. The third one, the third cross-cutting area that I want to focus on is more specific to Russia. It is about improving the management of natural resources. I'm sorry, there's a technical. Trying to exit the menu, so it's good? Okay, thank you. Let me start then with, okay. Okay, now I get there. Okay, apologies for that. The first point I want to mention is around sustainability, and that's the first, the fiscal sustainability. Many, as Anna mentioned before, many of the achievements in shared prosperity in the past that Russia achieved were driven by the positive impact of increasing public expenditure. And this was made possible by high oil prices and strong traditional export revenues. This trend came to a halt, and this trend as such was not sustainable. So the situation and the stress points are that actually non-oil deficits have remained persistently high at over 10% of GDP, despite continued attention to try to consolidate these. Low growth also has impacted deficits at the regional levels, and this will continue to be a source of concern going forward. So as fiscal buffers are depleting, there's a need to shift also to looking at expenditure composition, and new priorities have to be set. On the revenue side, new sources of revenue through diversification needs to be identified. And I've noted that in non-oil tax revenues in 2016, there's been a positive shift in the right direction, so sharp increases. So continued efforts at increasing revenues and making sure that public expenditures are as effective and efficient. That is a first cross-cutting requisite. The second foundation is good governance. In terms of good governance, governance issues apply to the whole of the economy, and they continue to be a serious issue for private sector growth. And these are constrained by perceptions of uncertain property rights and weak corporate governance. Improvements in the quality of public governance and in government effectiveness have been made. Progress has often been incremental, but over time, results have been significant, especially in the area of political stability, absence of violence, and improvement in the rule of law. Recently, Russia's performance on the government effectiveness dimension appears also to be improving significantly. However, Russia's ranking is still below the 50th percentile in most of the worldwide governance indicators, and Russia scores poorly on institution-related governance indicators such as transparency, voice and accountability, and corruption. The effectiveness of anti-corruption policy has been mixed, and implementation of the National Anti-Corruption Plan has been lagging. The quality of governance can facilitate or constrain Russia's progress towards higher productivity and diversified, inclusive growth. The third requisite, and this is why I wanted to have the slide clearly on the screen, is improved management of natural resources. This has multiple dimensions, but today I would like to focus really on one, and this is the use of energy. Russia has one of the most energy-intensive economies in the world. High energy intensity is rooted in subsidized energy tariffs and an aging capital stock. It is rooted as well in Russia's production structure and the spatial allocation of that production structure. It is interesting to actually compare Russia with Canada, both with cold climates, but with a very big difference in the spatial allocation of both production and population. You have in Canada a much larger share of the population living in the warmer parts of the country. Russia is actually an exception or an extraordinary case into that. Also, the high energy intensity has strong implications for the environment and climate change. Russia generates CO2 emissions comparable to the whole of Latin America. While Russia produces a quarter of Latin America's GDP and has less than a quarter of Latin America's population. It is also interesting to note that Russia uses twice as much energy per unit of GDP than Latin America. High energy intensity represents a significant drag on Russia's competitiveness. Addressing this problem will only have significant benefits for the environment. It will also lead to greater efficiency gains. Addressing this issue of energy efficiency will require significant investments, and that we have estimated that about 320 billion of investments would generate annual energy savings for end users of about 80 billion a year. This is an area of priority for investment going forward. Let me now move to the policy priorities. And here I would like to focus on two pathways that are critical for sustainable growth. The first pathway is increasing productivity for diversified growth, and the second is reducing vulnerability by deepening human capital and improving access to services. Within the first pathway, we see three areas of focus. First, creating a better investment climate and reallocating labor into higher productivity and formal jobs. Second, improving infrastructure and connectivity. And third, strengthening innovation and skills. Let me go a little bit more into the details of each of these three. First, productivity-led inclusive growth is deeply affected by economic distortions in markets and trade. And my colleagues showed clearly that issues on competitions and trade competitiveness are impediments to Russia's growth. We have issues around lack of competitions, regulations favoring incumbents and public firms, non-tariff barriers, and a feeble financial market. These challenges affect a variety of sectors throughout the economy, from agriculture and agribusiness to manufacturing and banking, just to name a few. Policy actions to create a better investment climate should include creating a level playing field for all firms by enhancing competition conditions and streamlining regulatory requirements for business operations. And I'm thinking there on the regulatory environment, in particular on inspection regime and encouragement to entrepreneurship and SME growth. A second area of action would be to deepen the financial sector to help improve access to finance for SMEs, introduce long-term financing instruments, and reduce the cost of credit. Third area of action, policy actions, is to remove non-tariff barriers. These would improve trade facilitation through greater reliance on risk management techniques, streamline international transit, and improve logistics. The key in this area, as I mentioned now, on creating a better investment climate and reallocating labor to higher productivity, is really around competition and, in a way, simplification. The second area that I've listed there, which is improving infrastructure and connectivity, I'd like to basically a priority should be given to removing infrastructure bottlenecks on the main trade corridors, together with improving logistics. It is also around ICT connectivity, and I see that Russia is giving a high priority to improving its ICT participation and connectivity. The core in this area is obviously to help Russia transition from a resource-oriented economy to one that is diversified and better integrated into global trading networks. In terms of policy actions to improve infrastructure and connectivity, one could include supporting labor mobility, and there are issues, for instance, on developing housing markets and transportation networks, reducing regulations that restrict the movement of labor, and assisting individuals with high job search and moving costs. That is addressing the spatial challenge of Russia that I mentioned before. Second policy area would be to remove infrastructure bottlenecks on the main trade corridors and improve logistics services. Very important within this, addressing the infrastructure bottleneck, will be infrastructure prioritization going forward. And there, I think I would suggest two key elements. The first one is improving the economic analysis of proposed infrastructure projects, building institutional capacity to manage large-scale initiatives, but also to redefine and consider the role that the private sector could play in addressing infrastructure bottlenecks. The third area that we have in this pathway, which is strengthening innovation and skills, is essential for Russia to participate in the global economy of the future. While enhancing the investment climate is fundamental to boosting productivity growth, this objective cannot be achieved without enhanced innovations and skills, and these two priorities have to be mutually reinforcing. Let me suggest a few areas of policy actions that can address the challenge of innovation and skills. First, support catch-up innovation and growth of internal business capability through interventions to help firms upgrade their capacities, and reforms for more competitive markets, less regulations, and better intellectual property protection. Second area is to improve Russia's science, technology, and innovation base and its contribution to the broader economy through better coordination and design of those interventions. Third area is aligning skills demand and methods of skills training. There, we're talking about strengthening the capacity of the skills development system and introducing a modern information system into the demand for and supply for skills and jobs. It is very clear that those companies, those firms that are most innovating are also those that build the most skills and find a way to create better jobs. That leads me to the second pathway. And the second pathway is on reducing vulnerability by deepening human capital and improving access to services. Let me start by first reducing premature mortality and bad health. All governments and societies share an objective to improving the health status and health outcomes of their populations. For Russia, demographic changes in labor markets make the economic case for improved health outcomes particularly urgent. Higher life expectancy with healthier aging would help counter the effect of declining working age population, the eroding skills and health of older workers. Russia and Japan are actually two countries that are facing the aging challenge with the most urgency. Into this, it will be therefore vital for Russia to allocate increased financial resources for health spending more efficiently with a focus on preventive care and outpatient services. A few policy actions that I would like to highlight that would reduce premature mortality and bad health. First, strengthen health promotion, disease prevention, early detection and management of non-communicable diseases. Second, reorient healthcare delivery towards greater reliance on primary health care to manage the growing epidemic of non-communicable diseases, and also avoid an unmanageable escalation of healthcare spending in the medium term. Third, it has to be linked to increasing the financial resources for health spending on outpatient services and preventive care, as fiscal constraints will allow, and improve access for poorer households. So that is the first area of reducing premature mortality and bad health. Secondly, is about ensuring the quality and access to education. Moving towards a more diversified economy, where growth is driven by higher productivity and sustained by higher innovation, does require a solid and improving human capital base. Quality education in particular will be crucial to equip the shrinking workforce with the skills and competencies demanded by firms. Gains can be achieved by improving inclusion in education, regardless of income level and location, thus laying the foundations for better inclusions into the labor markets. Currently, early childhood education and tertiary education constitute the greatest obstacles to Russia's progress in this area. To address these challenges, the education system not only needs more financial resources, it also needs to manage those resources more efficiently and equitably across regions and schools. The third area is around improving the effectiveness and efficiency of social protection. As my colleague Anna mentioned, Russia was very effective in reducing poverty through public spending and social programs. However, today you have still high vulnerabilities to economic shocks, along with a demographic shift to an aging population that makes social protection systems critical to prevent a deterioration in welfare and reversals in poverty reduction. The current system, while providing significant support to the vulnerable, operates inefficiently and appears to discourage formal employment. And it is not fiscally sustainable. In this area, we can identify policy actions that would focus on improving the efficiency and effectiveness of social assistance by improving the alignment of the objectives of social assistance and the instruments, consolidating overlapping programs, and improved targeting. The second area will be to reduce rigidity of the labor market institutions and curtail social security contribution exemptions to decrease informality and increase social security revenues. I would like to end this presentation on a positive note. The two pathways of increasing productivity and deepening human capital and the three cross-cutting foundations of fiscal sustainability, good governance, and improved natural resources management may seem daunting. However, I hope that in our presentation we will leave you with the impression that there is a clear way forward based on a strong track record of Russia tackling difficult challenges, and that these pathways and cross-cutting foundations can lead to inclusive growth into the future. I want to thank you, and we look forward to the comments and the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Cyril. This was a very interesting presentation indeed. And it is somewhat unusual compared to what we are used to. The kinds of presentations that we get here in Russia on the subject of economic development. We often see a different approach, a completely different angle. Now we're going to start taking comments, and I would like to first give the floor to Ksenia Yudaeva. But first, I would like to say that in the presentation, you did not touch upon the responsibility of the central bank, which also makes your presentation different from many other proposals and programs that we are getting. Inflation and exchange rate and this thing and the other. Those are the kinds of things that are very important for economic growth models. So I will ask Ksenia to make her comments as an economist. What do you think was the most interesting thing in the presentation? Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to say thank you to my colleagues. My congratulations on this interesting presentation indeed. A very useful presentation. I would encourage everyone to study this presentation. There's a lot of interesting materials, much more than we had time to present within this short time frame. Also, there are many interesting things regarding methodology. So it will be useful not only to politicians, but also to researchers and specialists. I would like to focus on a few main points that we found in this presentation, things that I thought were extraordinary and interesting. First of all, in the presentation, the authors say that in the last 15 years, Russia has seen serious achievements in the economy, in public welfare, and it has been inclusive growth indeed, which has contributed to decrease of poverty. This was growth based on middle-class consumption. In Russia, when we talk about growth, we keep saying that we have small middle class, but by international standards, it turns out that Russian economic growth was economic growth based on middle class welfare growth and growth of middle class in general through reduction of poverty level. Against this positive backdrop, one of the conclusions really makes us think hard. That is the conclusion that this growth happened due to effective redistribution of oil revenues. What this means is that, on the one hand, there are some fiscal risks. On the other hand, this growth is not sustainable because it depends on oil prices. On the negative side, I also see that there is a greater inequality in access to education and healthcare, which reduces the potential for inclusive growth in the future. That has also been covered at length in the presentation. The second important takeaway is that we see that the total factor of productivity is declining. In early 2000s, we have seen a serious increase in performance and in productivity, which was based on redistribution of labor between different sectors. Further productivity growth stopped because of lack of investment, because of lack of competition, low quality of governance, and lower labor quality, plus infrastructure issues and low ability of companies to act in an innovative way. It is very important to understand that the main subject of this presentation is long-term sustainable growth or potential growth. This is not a short-term thing. These are not short-term economic trends. Therefore, this presentation is really focused on a limited number of things. The presentation states that in the last 2 years, through fiscal and monetary policies and some anti-crisis measures, the economy has been able to adapt to new conditions, external conditions, and we were able to avoid stagflation. The economy is now aiming towards growth on a quarterly basis, and if we don't see any further shocks, we could see this growth continue and get stronger. The problem for the Russian economy is not to go back to the recovery growth. The main issue is, after a short phase of growth, not to go back to low rates of growth, not to go into a stagflation period. We should be able to support long-term economic growth. The issues and challenges that Russian economy faces have been identified. A lot of attention has been paid to the issue of demographics. Let me only mention one factor that has not been mentioned much. Main sectors where Russia has been specialized in foreign trade in the last 15 years, there are sectors where we see overproduction on a global scale. It's not only oil, it's also production of some metals and some other goods where Russia has had strong positions. So our economy has to change the structure. We cannot continue to do what we have been doing in the past. We have to change our specialization and focus, and the economy and the labor market have to show higher flexibility, and we have to support those structural changes, let them happen. This is the biggest structural challenge that our economy is faced with. As Sergey said before me, the presentation does not deal with the Central Bank of Russia policies in the monetary domain or sustainability of the financial sector. Monetary policy is a policy of short-term measures, and its impact on potential economic growth is limited. But we are also doing what I would call structural changes in monetary policies and in financial policy, in the regulatory measures we are taking. This can also play a significant role and make an important contribution to long-term economic growth. To make a link between our policies and the presentation, I will say that the presentation said that to address many challenges associated with productivity, infrastructure creation, better connectivity, it's important to provide long-term funding. Such funding can be provided if we look at the whole thing end to end. And for that, we need macroeconomic stability, which will include a stable budget, stable state finance, and low predictable inflation. Only in such an environment, businesses will be able to implement their long-term plans, and investors will be taking risks associated with such investment. The contribution of the Bank of Russia to this is to switch to inflation targeting back in 2014 policy towards reducing inflation to the level of 4% and sustaining inflation at the level of 4% in the years to come. Secondly, financial organizations should be trusted. They should have enough liquidity and capital so that they can assume long-term risks for long-term projects. The Bank of Russia is taking steps like introducing Basel III, better supervision, creating a healthier environment in the sector. Thirdly, we need to avoid systemic risks and avoid financial bubbles. Otherwise, even well-funded projects can face challenges. In this context, the central bank continuously monitors systemic risks. We use macro-prudential regulation tools. We use a counter-cyclic add-on. We have created a special working group which studies the opportunities associated with use of debt to revenue factors, and we are going to create a presentation on that. Fourth, not all financial organizations are good enough for long-term projects funding. If we want to do long-term funding, we need to develop those organizations and those instruments which are designed and which are capable of doing this. We have published our strategy for financial markets development, and the central bank is now implementing it. It has identified such instruments. Amongst the most important ones, I would say developing various investment instruments and developing bond markets. Labor situation is extremely important in financial and non-financial sectors. It's not enough to just create instruments. We need to be able to use them. We need to be able to structure projects and properly weigh out all risks. We are focused on our labor, and we will continue to work in that way. Those are just some of the things that we do in the central bank to support long-term economic growth. Amongst other things, I would mention financial services accessibility, because that also impacts the quality of economic growth. We need to make it inclusive, which is another focus of the presentation. We need to protect the rights of financial organizations. We need to improve financial literacy. Those are some of the other focus areas for us. We try to make the financial system work in such a way that financial services should be available to all organizations. We are especially focused on SMEs. In parallel, we have projects to improve financial literacy. We want people to be able to better use financial instruments and reduce risks. It's important to improve literacy amongst individuals and businesses. This is an area that we have faced problems in quite frequently. We also are looking for feedback. We have a project to get information from different organizations and people. And in the financial sector, we are at the center of innovative development. This is true for Russia, and this is true for many other parts of the world. The central bank cannot be passive in this area. We need to use new technologies to improve our performance, and we need to counter various cyber threats. We are going to use sandbox method to model different situations. We work with the markets to develop and implement new technologies together. In conclusion, I will just say that the central bank's work shows that the issue of long-term sustainable growth is a comprehensive challenge that touches upon different aspects of economic policy. So in the economic policy, on the one hand, we should focus on the main priorities. We should address the main barriers in the way of growth that we see out there. And it's also important, on the other hand, to fine-tune the whole system of state governance towards addressing long-term goals in all domains. Thank you. Thank you, Ksenia. The policy of Ministry of Finance has been addressed more, so I will now pass the floor to the representative of the Ministry of Finance, Vladimir Kolychev, and I would ask you to stay within the time frame of 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I first opened this presentation, I thought that I would really have nothing to add after our colleagues from the World Bank are done. But there is one point that I think I can comment on, something that can be added to what has been said. In the presentation, you have, in a way, said that one of the preconditions for switch to a new economic model is sustainable fiscal policy. I would like to comment on that. In countries that have high share of commodity revenues need macroeconomic sustainability, not just fiscal sustainability. It's important that all macroeconomic parameters like inflation and interest rates and volatility levels should be addressed. We are dependent on oil prices. Why this is important, not only for fiscal policy, but also for the potential growth rates. Unpredictable environment impacts investment decisions made by companies and organizations, and it affects the level of revenues that people would count on in their investment programs, and that can be a barrier in the way of investment. Look at the last 15 years. We have seen that as oil prices grew, the economic situation in the country has been changing. I'm talking about the structure of prices in the economy. When oil prices were growing, the structure of prices was changing in favor of non-tradable goods, and the tradable goods relative prices were going down. This brought about a situation of a kind. This was sending out some pricing signals to those non-tradable sectors. Essentially, there is nothing wrong with that. The bad thing was that those messages turned out to be unsustainable. When oil prices collapsed, we saw the change in the prices structure. It reversed back to the tradable goods, and investment in non-tradables had to be written off. So eventually, this brought about a situation when any project in a country that is not using a protective mechanism, the results, the performance of the economy would largely depend on the external environment. So it is very important that such mechanism should be put in place. I am calling this isolation from oil prices volatility, or we could also call that a budget rule. I am using this term because this is a more comprehensive mechanism. It has to do not only with the budget, but also with the larger mechanisms. It requires interaction between government, which determines the parameters of the budget rule, and the central bank, which is responsible for implementation of such budget rule. This is the first point. Whether or not this mechanism will be implemented, whether we will be more efficient, and we will be better off after we do that. On the other hand, structural limitations and constraints that the presentation has addressed should create a situation when the structure of different elements of the budget should change so that these structural constraints are eliminated. I could give you a number of examples. The presentation deals with the fact that we have high mortality amongst the working age population, and the older people are not economically active. We also see that a younger generation is not economically active, people who are university students. We could think of the possible change in the spending structure to eliminate such constraints gradually. The presentation is focused on the labor issues, on effective use of human potential, mobility of the labor and human resources, and also the issue of the shadow sector in the economy, which has impact on the distribution of resources. When companies compete not on the quality level and on the performance level, but instead they try to avoid taxes. This certainly creates problems in resource allocation. One could think of how the current structure of taxes is helping to reduce the share of shadow economy, how we could change that balance. This is important in the context of the labor market. We have seen a lot of research that are focused on the employment in the shadow economy, where performance of labor is lower, and it will continue to be lower in the future. These are the things that I wanted to say in my comments to this presentation, and these are my general observations on some of the areas that have been covered in the presentation, how things could affect macroeconomic policy in general. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to note one point, that Russia is not is not a separate economy. It's part of Eurasian Economic Union. And because of this, I'd like to ask a question to Mr. Pankin. What he believes in this report was most interesting for Russia as the standalone economy and for development of entire Eurasian Union and for deepening of integration. Thank you, Sergey. First of all, I'd like to emphasize the high quality of the report. Especially, I'd like to note such points as the analysis of human capital, analysis of the problems of inequality in the Russian economy. This is something new that this report generated. What I'd like to talk about and what I'd like to add, it's all the points related to participation of Russia in integration processes, participation of Russia in Eurasian space. In my view, these points are not sufficiently analyzed in the report, and I'd like to mention systematic points. Of course, Russia is 85% of GDP in the Eurasian community, but still participation of Russia in the external economic process, a number of the points I'd like to elaborate. First of all, the issues of transport infrastructure. In the presentation, a lot was spoken of about limitation because of the transport infrastructure of Russia, how to agree, how to have connection between the regions of the Russian Federation. In my view, talking about now, we cannot talk separately from the large-scale projects of the transport infrastructure of Eurasian space. And we're talking about the projects related to the Silk Road, this trunk line, horizontal ways, this with China, Central Asia, Europe. This is the issues of North-South, the road to India, Iran, Azerbaijan, and Russia, these trunk ways, these transport thoroughfares, how do they pass? What changes do they make to the transport landscape? Without this, in my view, we cannot talk about transport projects of Russia, and we have to take into consideration this work in the area of the connection of transport solutions in our economy with the large transport projects of the Silk Road. The second point I'd like to make, this is the issue of the human capital. the issues, the questions about the labor force of the Russian Federation. Absolutely correct reference was made that the key problem is the aging of the population. It is necessary to talk about pension age. But what was not mentioned, and in my view must be considered, is the migration problem. 15% of the labor force of Russian Federation are migrants. Every year, 4 million people enter Russian Federation and fill out immigration applications, and they say they write that they come to here to work. The processes related to the labor force must be considered to be with the migration, reflecting dynamics and opportunity of moving between the provinces. This is a very important factor. The third point I'd like to mention is the future expansion of the Eurasian community, the agreement about the zones of free trade. There is a number of negotiations underway with Singapore and India and Korea and Israel. These are the countries with whom we negotiate about creation of the free trade zones. In the future, this can generate systemic change to the Russian economy. According to the assessment of the experts of Eurasian Economic Commission, the conclusion of contract on opening of the free trade zone with Korea increases GDP in Russia from 0.2 to 0.6% of GDP per annum. This is a substantial point that changes the picture of the Russian Federation. Also, I'd like to consider, when we talk about potential levers, and now the customs regulation, and in many ways non-tariff barriers, they come out of the national jurisdiction. It is necessary to arrange with our Kazakh, Belarusian partners, Kyrgyz partners. That is not always simple, despite of seemingly incomparable size of the economies. The fourth point I'd like to mention, and should we take into consideration, very interesting statements in the presentation about inequality of those instruments that help to solve the problem of inequality in the Russian Federation. So let's take a look at our neighboring countries, because I believe that's very important to compare Russian economy not only with Brazil and Mexico, but also with our neighbors, such as Kazakhstan, Belarus, Armenia. It's not by coincidence the society scientists created the concept of the neighboring countries, because these countries are similar in mentality, in economic and public. The poverty level in the 15th year was 13%, in Kazakhstan 3%, and Belarus 5%. Gini coefficient in Russia is about 42, and more is worse. In Kazakhstan and Belarus, it gradually decreased and is about 27 scores. In my view, it's a very interesting question, how to compare social policy in decrease of level of inequality of the revenues in Russia and the neighboring countries. Should we use example such as Belarus? Should we go this direction? Yes, in terms of the poverty level and social inequality. The indicators in those countries are much better. In Kazakhstan, this indicator is much better than in Russia. It would be nice to at least compare the experience of those countries and see what we can use and what we cannot use. In conclusion, I'd like to perhaps mention couple points that are interesting to look upon the experience of our neighboring countries. Development of human capital, development of education, increase of quality of human capital. This is absolutely correctly mentioned in the presentation of the World Bank. Let's look at our neighbors in Kazakhstan. Balashak problem. Since 1993, the essence is that the young people are sent to receive education in the best educational institutions of the world. Now it's 3,000 per year, paid by the state. They study and return. They work in corporate sector, in banks, and really even speaking to the public officials and the corporate employees, we see the changes. People who have experience in the best Western schools, they work with serious state institutions. In my view, it's a very interesting example. And once again, we can use this example in the Russian Federation. For instance, such point as the system of the state procurement. In this case, we should look at the experience of Armenia, Kyrgyz Republic, Kazakhstan, where legislation is made on the basis of the standards of the World Bank, and to a great extent, the legislation on procurement is more advanced than in Russian Federation, and in principle, the usage of this experience would allow to substantially, in our view, improve situation of the competitiveness in the Russian Federation. And maybe coming to a conclusion of my short presentation, what else? What other points are left after reading the presentation? We see a set of recommendations. Absolutely correct to talk about modernization of Russian economy, about innovation, about business. Is this new for us? No. We see it in the other reports dedicated to the Russian Federation. They all talk about changes related to more flexible development and departure from the resource-oriented economics. Can we say that substantial changes took place in this part of our economy? Perhaps not. So the summary is this. We have to look deeper. We have to look at that public model that we have, the public psychology that doesn't allow us to switch to more dynamic model of development and think perhaps deeper about the system of values of our society, about what must be changed and what must not be changed in order to achieve more dynamic development. Thank you. So we have the commentary of Alexander Dynkin. Thank you, Sergey. Good morning. Really, the report is rather different because the World Bank moves the accents from the macroeconomic problems to the problem of competitiveness of the Russian industries, sectors, and the problem of increase of productivity and accumulation of human capital. Such change of the content of the presentation, I see the acknowledgement of maturity of the macro regulators in Russia, first of all of the Central Bank of Russia and the Ministry of Finance of the Russian Federation. And this tells us about the cyclical measures that are being applied in this sphere are quite adequate. Simultaneously, such a shift of approach is risky for the World Bank because industrial things, microeconomics, always more complex for the external observer rather than from macroeconomical things. I will not speak up the compliments because the work is very professional, is based on quite professional analysis that can withstand stress tests. I'll tell a few things that created questions in my head. The question number one relates to touching upon such as vital things Majority of offered measures, they have non-targeted character, but intended for improvement of investment climate that creates a feeling that such a standard multi-year set of recommendations to the Russian government, such as development of competitiveness, budget stability, administrative reform, transport infrastructure, they're simply renamed into the measures how to overcome barriers on the way to the growth of productivity. In order to make illustration and the argument, considering information and communication sector, discussion of measures in this sector dedicated to four pages, 81 and 85, and the issue of lifting the barriers, 20 straight pages dedicated. It's clear that total economic barriers are necessary, but perhaps not sufficient growth of productivity. Judge for yourself. It's quite simple example. Since 2000 till 15th year, the length of automotive roads with hard surface grew by 50%, but this result does not reflect on statistics of productivity of labor. So general approaches, in my view, need a certain detailization. Now, this inclusive growth ideology, it cannot cause any objections because it intended for improvement of the state of 40% of less revenue receiving population. And so there is a feeling that this approach is used slightly rather mechanical. If movement of the labor resources from stagnating sectors to the sphere of service, from formal to informal, can enable improvement of revenue of low-paid category of laborers, the policy of creation of high efficiency will have different effects, because in this case key benefits will be given to the specialists with high qualification, and perhaps even change and difference of the salary will grow by 40% in comparison to the low-income laborers. It will be contradiction, obviously, from the standpoint of inclusive growth, but in my point of view, is quite formal. And perhaps the authors fairly concentrated attention to how to overcome apathy. The high added value and high individual revenue is the real way to the growth quality of life, and prevention of the flight of qualified specialists. This objective is quite strategic for us. But during analyzing this apathy, the offered measures how to overcome apathy, in my view, create not enough additional knowledge. In my point of view, the important question was not mentioned regarding the institutional traps of our national innovative system. If you look at the proposal on supply side, why such transplantation of institutes that took place here by creation of the practical instruments of classical Anglo-Saxon innovation system didn't lead to innovative growth? If you look at the side of the demand side, important question in my view, so-called institutional economy of scale, domination of large firms, or the corporate structure with dominating owners that obviously are not inclined to have innovative risks, how they decrease the level of inclination towards innovations. The obvious problem for many who in business of this topic. And we have known Chinese wall between defense research and the commercial sector, how to overcome this thing. In the world, there is rich experience in this area, or the central question, how to shift competition for the administrative resource that blocks innovation to the market competition for the consumer. without answer to these questions. In my view, this microanalysis that we see here, that is intended for increase of efficiency, for innovative growth, in my view, doesn't seem to be complete, and the World Bank has a large field of analysis. Thank you, Alexander. And we move to the last part of our presentation of the report. It's the questions to the authors of presentation from the members of mass media. Marina Vasilieva will be helping us how to administer this function, so members of the conference can ask questions. We'll see how much time we have left. Somebody must carry the microphone around. Please come. We have question. Come to me. You need to switch on the microphone. I'm not a member of media. I'm from the Ministry of Finance. Unfortunately, we received this presentation only in English. In opening the Russian translation, we can find such a phrase: a throughput problem of the state governance, corruption, submission, and supervision. Supervision and is not problem of the state management. Also, I'd like to note number of the mistakes that can be found in the presentation related to the fact, for instance, the same graph is called different names. For instance, on the page 3 and 57 in English, and also we can find mistakes in numbers of the pages in English, and so on and so forth. Of course, in terms of the content, we can have a lot of criticism. I have questions to the members of the World Bank. Usually, a report of this or that country is made in order to invest into this country, on the condition when the World Bank cuts the presence in the Russian Federation, the condition when the strategy acts until 2015 is coming to the end. I'd like to clarify what's the purpose of this report and how World Bank is planning.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Cyril, you want to take up this one?
The purpose of the report is actually to provide a diagnostic that will inform actually the strategy that we will be preparing for the Russian Federation going forward. And we will do so in the coming year. And we'll do so also using a very consultative process that engage government, but also civil society, business, and other stakeholders.
Any further questions, please? Please go ahead. Morning. Thank you very much for the presentation. I thank the panelists and the other members. I represent the Institute of Economy, Ivan Starikov. I'll be brief. A few years ago, in this particular room, we talked about middle income trap. Well, this issue is no longer present because now from $14,000 per capita, we are now at the level of $8,000 per capita. We're drowning in poverty. We heard some figures from Ksenia, from Aleksey, and others. Well, let me tell you the following. What do we have to do in order to relieve this country of the smell of poverty? Well, we got to do something about it. I think one of the key achievements of the outgoing President Obama was the establishment of Trans-Pacific Partnership. Well, look, bringing together 16 countries under the TPP who produce 40% of the global GDP, well, it's a humongous task. And the TPP was set up to offset China. Now, if you are serious about moving away from dependency on commodity prices and hydrocarbon prices, this country has one resource that still is very much valuable. It is our territory. It's 17 million square kilometers. And we are between two markets where there are some 140 million consumers are located. Well, this is something we did discuss previously. We got to do something about it. We got to suggest to the President-elect Trump not to dismantle the TPP, but instead to create a transport corridor through Russia all the way to Pacific. And in fact, I talked about this at the meeting of the Integration Council, and this work is based on Paul Krugman's work, Spatial Economy. The paper that generated a Nobel Prize for Mr. Krugman. So here comes my question. Perhaps we can do the same as our ancestors did. They built Trans-Siberian Railway. It was the most illustrious project at that time. And in September 2016, we celebrated 100 years since the commissioning of this route. So perhaps we could think hard and suggest to the World Bank and other colleagues, for instance, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, to implement another similar project. Well, Chinese are building their Silk Road. They are pushing toward European markets. And I think Russia would be in a position to come up with its own options, and we could link together the Trans-Siberian route and this new Silk Road. Thank you. Thanks a lot. I don't think it's actually a question that requires a response, at least not from the World Bank. We'll just take note of this. Now, please ask your questions. Questions to the authors and presenters. Just one question, one last question, okay? Right. Please use a microphone. And with this, we'll wrap up. Microphone, please. Morning. Can you hear me? Anatoly Rabinovich, head of the National Pensions Association. I've got a question as far as pensions are concerned. My question goes to the World Bank and to Ksenia. I think that unless we talk about increasing retirement age, you did not pay sufficient attention to the need to improve and establish a better funded component. What do you think about paying pensions to working retirees? What do you think about paying merit-based pensions? And what do you think about the evolution of the pension system in this country from the strategic standpoint? These are the questions for the World Bank, and here's a question for Ksenia. We know that the Central Bank and the Finance Ministry are hammering out their pension concept. You put a freeze on the funded component since 2019, so perhaps we could start discussing those initiatives, not just with the media, but also with the professionals in the field. I'm sorry, I'm going to use my right as a moderator. I will ask the World Bankers to take up this question, and Ksenia perhaps will entertain this question next time, or maybe during future sessions during today. So please.
So I think all countries with aging populations, not just Russia, are facing the same dilemma as to what to do with their pension systems, because the model, pension systems to date are largely built on a model that assume you would have a larger base of workers that will, from which to draw from the contributions to pay pensions. And as societies age, this becomes less feasible. We have done, separately from this report, the World Bank did an extensive report on pensions in the Europe and Central Asia region that you can look up on the website. It goes into a lot of details. But essentially, pensions have multiple objectives. First, they have an anti-poverty objective, that is to protect the elderly from being poor. Second, they have an income replacement objective, that is to replace the income that you made when working. In the past, you were able to achieve these two objectives with the same single pay-as-you-go type pension system. That will no longer be that easy as population ages. So I think there is an issue of countries thinking through their pension system to ensure that there is a component to the pension system that is a pension that protects all elderly people from poverty. And there's no question that that has to be publicly funded. I think the income replacement part of pensions, that is the part that replaces the income you made while working, increasingly will rely on mechanisms that necessarily involve some form of private saving. You have many different models of doing this, from compulsory second pillars to voluntary schemes, but almost every country in the world, and I think I can say that with a certain degree of comfort, every country in the world that is facing aging demographics is going to have to move in the direction of prioritizing which parts of the pension are funded publicly and which parts will have to rely on private savings, and that's the direction that most pension reforms have to go into. We have a report that goes into the particular challenges of the Europe and Central Asia region at length. It is publicly available on our website, so it's a very interesting report. It also gives you the history of how pension systems have evolved and how expectations of what pension systems will do have evolved. Each country will have to tackle this in a way that suits its context, but there's no doubt in my mind that the priority for the public sector is to ensure that no elderly person is poor. For that, you need a basic pension. It will be important to induce private savings and for individuals to save more for retirement on their own, with some role for the state to redistribute and address risk pooling and so forth. So that would be my answer.
Спасибо.
Thanks a lot. Distinguished colleagues, unfortunately, we have to call it a day. The session is over. I once again would like to express my gratitude to all the panelists, all the participants. Especially would like to thank the World Bankers. And until we meet again, thank you.